So can you talk about the 7 core presentation elements that technical professionals tend to include? Love to learn more about that.
A little bit of background about this methodology that I've been teaching folks. What I tried to do is I said, look, technical people, we give these presentations and rewrite papers all the time, and we tend to include they have a standard structure. And if we want to really influence people that aren't our technical peers, we need to talk about those things in a different way. And so what I've done is I've sort of said, these are the key elements that we typically talk about anyway. Let me show you how to transform those.
Did you know that professionals with strong presentation skills are 60% more likely to be promoted? And that well-communicated technical ideas can boost project approval rates by over 50%. Despite this, many engineers and scientists struggle to present their innovations in a way that really resonates with decision makers. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Angelique Adams, Ph.D., MBA, leadership coach, and CEO of Angelique Adams Media Solutions. Dr. Adams has previously shared her expertise with our audience through her insightful article titled, How to Stand Out in High-Stakes Meetings. And we are thrilled to welcome her to dive deep into the topic further today. Specifically, we're going to be talking about mastering presentations to advance your careers and gain buy-in for your ideas. We're going to be talking about the 7 core elements of impactful presentations, common mistakes to avoid, and reveal 2 of the most essential techniques for making technical content engaging and persuasive. If you want to make your presentations more compelling and ensure your ideas get the recognition they deserve, this conversation is going to be for you. I'm your host, Rebecca Swaby, and this is the AEC Leadership Podcast, previously the Engineering Career Coach Podcast. Let's dive right in. So to start, can you tell us a bit about yourself? What inspired you to transition from a technical career to coaching and training PhD scientists and engineers?
Yes, so I started out in a very technical career early on, and then became a leader pretty early on in my career inside of an organization. So I started with a team of 3 people, and then I continued to grow that to larger and larger technical teams. And I really enjoyed that. I pretty quickly realized that I enjoyed leadership more than I enjoyed being in the lab. So I've had that orientation pretty much my whole career. And it wasn't until I left the company that I had worked for 20 years and moved to a new company and realized, oh, wow, here I am. They brought me in to lead innovation, which I was doing. But the team that I had didn't have like the career development and leadership development skills that I was used to. And so I started to coach them. I started to do trainings for them to kind of help them build their leadership skills and also help them build their own career paths. So there wasn't a good kind of career path options for people in the technical field in the organization I was in. So I started doing that, and I was doing that for a couple of years, and the team just really, really responded to it. And I thought, wow, like I really like this. Like this is a lot of fun. And then COVID hit, and I think like so many people, it was an opportunity to just reevaluate a lot of different things. So at the time, I was actually traveling back and forth between the US and Europe every other week. So I was really commuting. And then when COVID hit, nobody went anywhere for a while. So I had this quote unquote free time to both self-reflect, but also I did this bucket list thing and I wrote a career guide for women in STEM, really bringing in a lot of the principles and the things I was teaching my own team. And I just made this book. And it did better than I ever could have expected. It became an Amazon #1 bestseller for a very brief period of time, enough to take a screenshot of the like #1, a picture of the #1. And I thought, you know what? This is a sign that I might be called to do something a little different. And so that's when I decided to pivot in 2021. So my company will be 4 years old on April 15th, which is US Tax Day. Completely coincidence. It just happened to be when I resigned in Europe, and you got to still work for 3 months after you resign. They have a completely different system over there. But anyway, it turns out my business will be 4 years old on April 15th. And it was really those indicators, just really loving the leadership side, realizing I really love training and coaching my own scientists and engineers that were working for me, and then getting some indications that, yeah, maybe there's actually a market for this because the book did so well and people were asking me to speak and do things like that. So that's when I decided to make the leap to try it out on my own.
Well, we're so happy that you did and that we can learn from you today. So, can you talk about the 7 core presentation elements that technical professionals tend to include? Love to learn more about that.
Yes, absolutely. So a little bit of background about this sort of this methodology that I've been teaching folks. What I tried to do is I said, look, technical people, we give these presentations and rewrite papers all the time. And we tend to include they have a standard structure. And if we want to really influence people that aren't our technical peers, we need to talk about those things in a different way. And so what I've done is I've sort of said, these are the key elements that we typically talk about anyway. Let me show you how to transform those so that people who aren't your technical peer could understand them. And then one of the things that I've done here recently is I've participated in a lot of pitch competitions for people who are in the hard tech, Ph.D. scientists and engineers who want to commercialize their technology. And so I've sat in all these pitch competitions, and I paid really close attention to the questions that these people were getting. And I said, okay, how can I help these scientists and engineers craft better presentations based on the questions that they continually get over and over and over again, and like these more business-minded audiences don't understand. So that's sort of the background behind these 7 different categories that I'm going to talk about. So the first category is what I'll call current condition. So current condition really just describes the environment that you're working in as it is today. So whether it's might be the current way that a technical problem is being solved, or it may be that nobody's trying to solve that problem, but it's just a description of the current environment as it is today. And then the second component is the target condition. This is like your goal. This is where you're trying to get to through your work. And you describe that kind of like, what will life be like when we actually solve this problem in the way that we're trying to solve it? And then the third component is the methodology. So what are sort of the key steps or the key techniques or processes that you are using to actually solve this problem? And this tends to be an area where technical folks, they'll use extremely technical language. They'll talk about really specific pieces of equipment and really high-tech analytical techniques. I spend a lot of time working with them saying, sorry, but most of your audience probably just wants to know if you used like a laboratory or a computer, or did you simulate like that? Just start with that. And then if they ask you follow-up questions, then you can get into some of the,
Makes
the
sense.
details, but just start at high level. And then the third is the results. So of course, like what have you found so far in your work? And I think that the key here is to make sure that you talk about that in reference to the real important like performance indicators that people would understand. So those tend to be, again, not necessarily the technical results that come immediately out of this high-tech equipment that you've used, but it's things like, did you save time? Did you save money? Did you make it safer? Those are sort of the way that we like to frame results for a non-technical audience. And then the fifth component is the next steps. So what either are you going to do next to kind of continue the work forward, or what might you recommend someone else do? If they're going to kind of continue the work for whatever reason, you can just describe those next steps. Another component, the sixth component, is what I call strategic fit. And what this means is that the audience that you're talking to, they have things that they care about. And so it's always important to try to relate what you're doing back to what they care about. So if you are talking to, for example, investors, then you really need to understand like what are the things that they're investing in and why are they investing in those sorts of things? And how is your technology or your business, how does it fit in with what they care about? If you're inside of a company and you're even just talking to your boss or maybe the board of directors, the CEO, again, there's a strategy there that they have articulated that is important to the organization. And you need to make sure that you can show how what you're doing fits within that. And then the last component is, it's not really something that I proactively want you to write about or to communicate, this is more like a check. I call these unforced errors. So once you've sort of put your communication together and you've covered all of these things, let's make sure we haven't done things that can make it hard for your audience to understand you. So this is making sure you're getting rid of all of your acronyms, making sure you've not put images on there that nobody can figure out what they really are because they're so unique to what you're doing, or of course, spelling errors and things like that. Or another big one that technical folks will often do is they will show graphs with units that nobody understands but them. And so making sure that you really have clarified that, and again, use sort of layperson terms when you're describing graphs. In fact, I tell most technical people will have to make a second graph. Whatever data it is that you have that you got from your equipment or even your analysis, chances are if you're talking to any kind of senior leader or executive, turn it into a 2-level bar graph. Like just find a way or maybe one line, a line chart. But doing that interpretation in advance is really helpful. It's much better than getting up there and trying to explain it on the fly because people don't have the bandwidth to really understand that. So those are the 7 things that I teach folks to do. And when you do that, when you understand that methodology, then you can really take any technical work, any technical presentation, and with a little bit of work and practice, you can transform it into something that is much more digestible and much more interesting to other audiences. And that's how you can get them interested in whatever it is that you want to do. If you're looking for additional funding, or if you're looking for just support, or if you're looking for maybe somebody to take your work into consideration in a decision that they need to make, when you can sort of encapsulate it in that way, it becomes a much more powerful communication tool.
This is so helpful. I'm already thinking back onto presentations that I've made and all the ways that, I've gone wrong. It sounds so simple when you put it this way. What steps do you think are the most difficult to master? Like, where are the most common pitfalls in this process where we still go wrong, even despite having the steps in front of us?
The most common pitfall is not translating the sort of units of measure and data into layperson's terms. So that does take quite a bit of practice. That can take some effort. And the first couple times you do it, you might struggle to do that. So I suggest that you try to find an audience, somebody who could be sort of a practice audience for you, and to say, hey, like, are you getting this? Do you understand? Have I converted this into something that you think, is appropriate for whatever audience that you're speaking with? And I like to tell folks that unless you're speaking to somebody who sits in your team meetings with you on a regular basis, you have to make that translation. Those are the only, everybody else needs some sort of translation done for them. And that's often part of the reason why that pitfall persists, is because lots of folks will assume, oh, well, I'm speaking to another engineer. Yeah, okay, but they're probably a different engineer, or in my case, I'm an engineer. But when I was leading these large organizations, I mean, I was far beyond my own technical expertise at that point. The organization was just way too broad. Never mind that, I had so many projects that I was working on that even if I could remember, for example, the corrosion of a very specific stainless steel under these conditions, even if I did know that at one point, it's not something I can recall after a long day of back-to-back meetings. And so use that as a sort of frame of reference. If they're not in that meeting with you on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, then you're going to need to do some of this translation that I'm talking about, both with your numbers, your data analysis, and even some of your language, right? So get rid of all the acronyms and just speak in plain language. And you can practice it. And, with things like ChatGPT now, there's no reason why you can't do that quickly, right? You can put some of those acronyms in, or you can put some of the descriptions in and just say, just ask it. Say, how would you describe this in layperson's terms?
Right. You could see how, when you have 10 pages of strong metrics, for example, and you want to include them all, how it can be very difficult to just pick and choose the ones that are most effective. Do you find that that's something that comes up a lot, is just knowing what to include and what to leave out?
Yes, absolutely. And that's where going back to the strategic fit question
Mhm.
comes into play, because your specific audience will have metrics that they have already told you they care about. They've told you through their leadership communications, they've told you on their website, or they've told you in their annual report, or whatever hopefully homework you've done
Mhm.
to get to know your audience. They've kind of already told you the metrics they care about. And then I also like to tell people, you can have backup slides, right? People can ask you questions and you can get into those details later. But in the beginning, you have to be clear enough so that your audience can sort of do enough pattern recognition to say, okay, I kind of understand what they're saying. And now I have a couple of questions about how this might relate to something else I already know. And so it has to be clear enough for them to be able to do that. Otherwise, you just get the blank stare. And I think we've all been in those meetings where we can sort of tell, like, we're talking to somebody who, like, they left the room, metaphorically. And so we want to avoid that. We want to hold our audience's attention.
That makes sense. So it sounds like it would be a win if, you got through, it was clearly understood, and then there were more questions to dive
Yes,
deeper.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Coming to the end and just hearing crickets, maybe not so much.
Well, so I actually think that the absolute number one thing you want is them to make a decision
Mm.
based on your executive summary. So, and I used to tell my team, let's do our executive summary. And if we never even get to the backup slides, that's a win for us. That means we were so clear and so compelling in one slide that the people who have the purse strings, the people who have the money could say, oh, yes, yeah, absolutely, go do it. But of course, then you start getting into your details, and then people ask you questions, and that is also that's sort of your second level win, is that people are engaged enough to want to learn more, and and are taking things into consideration. So for sure.
Oh, that's great. Many professionals can struggle with confidence when presenting. What mindset shifts can help them feel more comfortable and persuasive? And what are some key pitfalls to avoid when presenting, especially to executives or in higher stakes meetings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of things that I do myself and that I suggest to others. So one is that it's really important to understand that you need to practice these presentations. Like, if you kind of think about the people who are actually really good at this, and the people who, seem to just walk into a room and command the room, it's because they've been doing it for a while. It's because they have actually taken the presenting piece of the overall sort of communication strategy. They have taken that as a skill to perfect and improve. So it's not a matter of just putting your slides and saying, okay, I've got everything, and then I'm just going to go stand up there and everything's going to go well. That's not really how it works. I don't know anybody who can do that.
Oh,
And
that's too
so
bad.
I know, right? I wish it did. I really wish it did. So take that as a skill that you want to improve. And so there's a couple of things you can do. First of all, you practice, record yourself, video yourself actually delivering a presentation. Look for some distracting behaviors that you may be doing. So extra filler words, moving around. So I'm obviously, everybody's going to watch this video and see me moving around. I'm more animated here than I am in an executive briefing, but moving around, dropping the technology, fiddling with the clicker. I mean, there's all sorts of potentially distracting behaviors that you may be doing. And so video yourself and see what's going on. And if you find that you are doing some of those distracting behaviors, you can go online, and there's tons of tools and tips on how to improve those things. And then also practice the Q&A. So that's another area where I see a lot of people can do great when they have their slides and they have their presentation, and then just sort of crash and burn in the Q&A. And that's the last impression that you leave with people. And so if you either can't answer the questions at all and refuse to say the perfectly okay thing, can I get back to you? If you
Uh-huh.
refuse to say that, or, and this is another thing where people can sort of blow it at the Q&A, is if you seem frustrated and annoyed that people were asked you questions, or even if you may have covered it in your slides, sort of sending indications that you're annoyed that people ask you questions is also not good behavior. So practicing your Q&A. And then I like to have a pre-speaking ritual. So I think that, if you know this is going to be a potentially stressful situation for you, then you might want to think about how you handle other stressful situations and what are some tools and tips that work well for you. So for me, that is having, even if it's just a 5-minute little ritual, I, do a little bit of deep breathing. I maybe walk off a little bit of extra nervous energy. And then I have a little affirmation that I say that I'll share with everybody. I have a little affirmation that I say that kind of puts me in the right mindset for, okay, now I'm going to get into this room and I've got to become sort of speaker Angelique, which is a little bit of a different mode than just sort of my normal everyday. And that kind of helps me turn myself on, if you will, to engage with an audience in maybe a little bit different way than I normally would. And my affirmation, so it's actually something I learned from a coach. It is just 4 little sentences. It says, I'm glad I'm here, which is always true. If I've been invited to speak somehow, even if it's to defend myself, right? To defend something that I did. But if I've been invited, then like, okay, I'm glad I'm here. Then I say, I say to myself, I'm glad you're here. So I'm absolutely, what a privilege it is to speak to whatever audience that you're in. The third thing is I know what I know. And this is a really important one because oftentimes we can be intimidated by the people we're speaking with, particularly as we're, ascending into leadership roles or maybe our first executive briefing or something like that. And we're thinking, okay, those people are all so much smarter than me. And what could I possibly be able to tell them? But in reality, like nobody has lived your life. Nobody has had your experiences but you. So if you go in there and just speak what you know based on the experiences that you've had, you can feel confident in at least you can feel like you have integrity with what you're talking about. They may not like your decisions. They may not like your analysis. They may not like, who knows. But if you say, okay, I did the best I could and I know what I know, so I'm going to go in and deliver this to them, that can really help. And then the last thing last part of it is that I care about you. And when I say I care about you, that just reminds me, okay, they're here. I care that they understand what I'm trying to say. And so that means that, if I need to go out of order in my slides because somebody asks a question, that's okay. I'm there to help them understand this important information. I'm not there to teach my whatever. If they ask questions, again, I'm there to help communicate with them. I care about them, understanding. And so it kind of puts me in the mindset to be a little bit more flexible and open to what ends up happening with the audience when you get into the room. Because it's not the case that I control all of the factors, right? I can't just go in, talk exactly the way I want to, expect no questions or get the exact questions I prepared for and everything goes smoothly, right? That's not going to happen. So if I say, but I care about this audience, then it puts me personally in the mindset of being a little bit more flexible. So that's sort of having this pre-speaking ritual can also really help. So you've practiced your slides, you've practiced for Q&A, you have a pre-speaking ritual, and then sort of go in there. Then the last piece is to do a little bit of a feedback loop. Be honest with yourself afterwards. What went well? What didn't go well? What might I do differently next time? And then just get better. What questions did I get? Write those down so you'll be ready for the next time. And then it's just a continuous feedback loop. And then you go from, at least in my case, your thesis defense where you just got through it and then, vomited immediately afterward. You start there. And now, you do TED Talks and podcasts and whatever. So
Right.
over years, right?
Right. That's such a good cycle. And I can see that things would definitely improve over time. For
Right.
those that maybe it's their first time or, they're still fairly nervous, what kind of indications would you might have that you've practiced sufficiently?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me think about that. I don't know exactly what could tell you that. I mean, I think that if you've practiced and you can get through the presentation and you can get through Q&A and your own internal body signals. I mean, I think this is really where
Mm.
just checking in with your body can be really helpful. I think checking in with your own internal body signals, that those are good indications. But I got to tell you, in all honesty, practicing even in front of a small group can be very different. That the whole situation can be very different when you're either in front of a larger audience or in front of people that you perceive to be extremely important for whatever reasons, high stakes, as you had said earlier. So expect there to be a little bit of a different feeling, even though you've practiced,
Yeah, that makes
and might
sense.
feel comfortable in the practice setting. I think at the end of the day, you really should congratulate yourself for having done it. I mean, so many people will avoid the whole thing, right? Won't even accept the opportunity to present in front of a group. And so that's the other thing I would say is that I don't know anybody who loves it. I mean, you know what I mean? So don't set this expectation that you're only good at giving presentations if, you sort of walk in and your pulse stays, the same level it was when you were laying down, and you feel, there's no extra sweating, and like, I don't think that's a real thing. And so it shouldn't be a goal. Your goal, I think, should be, did I get through it? Did I communicate with my audience what I had hoped to communicate? Do I have indications that they got what they needed from me? And are we able to move forward in whatever sort of collaboration or whatever that we had hoped? That's, I think, a much better goal for your communication than like thinking it's a breeze, because I don't know that that's ever going to happen.
What I like so much about this is it's almost like a scientific method of sorts that we can apply, right? Like when
Sure.
we're not feeling, you're going to feel nervous, you're going to feel anxious, you're going to feel whatever. But at the end of the day, what you've provided us with is a method to move through systematically to improve over time. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Just to go back a little bit to one of our earlier questions, maybe you can give us some ideas and some tips for engineers and scientists to help them simplify complex concepts without losing out on key details.
Yes. So I think that one of the strategies that can be really helpful is this idea of starting with a simple analogy of what you're talking about. So I really like for scientists and engineers to think about a partial analogy. And I even use the word kind of like. So whatever it is that you're doing is kind of like this other thing. And the words kind of like, at least in sort of U.S. Dialect, is it means that they're similar but not exact, and that can be very tough for technical folks to accept, that they're like comparing two things that maybe are only like 50-60% comparable. But what that does is it helps your audience take this really complex thing and compare it to something that they already know about. And I'll use a specific example. Work with an entrepreneur who works on hydrogen fuel cells. And he has this great technology that is about regenerating the catalyst and allowing for fuel cells to last longer. Okay, so it's extremely complicated. I don't understand how it all works. But the minute that he put forth this analogy that it was going to be like a quick lube or a jiffy lube for fuel cells, where you could put the fuel cell in, get a quick refurbishment, and leave, as opposed to the current technology where you have to, I think you may even have to just send it out and buy a new one or something like that. So but as soon as that simple analogy, and he even could use pictures, like it's a jiffy lube for fuel cells, everybody started to say, oh, okay, so I don't even need to know about the technology yet to understand, sort of basically, that, he's providing this service that quickly, makes some adjustments that allows allows this technology to be usable again fast. And so those can be extremely helpful, again, to initially allow your audience to just do a little bit of pattern recognition, because then they'll ask, oh, okay, how exactly do you do that? Oh, okay, tell me more about, this part of it or this other part of it, or how do you do it so quickly, or and then you can kind of hold their hand and bring them through to some of the more technical details. But if you start with the complexity, then, as we've said before, you completely lose your audience. So I love the idea of simple analogies. Again, this is another place where you can use artificial intelligence, like the ChatGPT or your favorite chat bot, to even give you some suggestions. I've actually done this. So I just taught this methodology I teach an engineering leadership course at the University of Tennessee, and I gave them the prompt. I actually said, use this prompt with a project that you're working on and see if it can't give you 5 or 6 simple analogies to explain your project or your technology that you can live with. Again, simple analogy. It's not going to be precise. If you can give that up in service of a little bit of clarity to your audience, then you can get more precise later.
Such a good example. Yeah. And in the startup world, you hear all the time, the Uber for
Yes.
X, and it's a bit overdone, but
Yes.
your example, that it makes it really clear, the Jiffy Lube of
Right. Jiffy Lube with fuel cells. Yes,
fuel
exactly.
Great. We talked earlier about your audience, knowing your audience and what's motivating them. Can you talk a little bit about how professionals can tailor their message for different audiences to gain more buy-in for their ideas?
Absolutely. So this starts with really developing what I like to call professional empathy, which is really gaining an appreciation and respect and awareness for how other functions in an organization or inside your organization or other entities outside of your organization, not only what they care about in terms of perhaps the metrics that they focus on, but also sort of their professional culture. Like how do they talk? What kind of acronyms do they use? And what are the incentives for their work? And so all you have to do is ask people about those things. So it's not hard to learn. But when you start to build that, then you have really the feedstock for then tailoring your audience. And so now if you have what I would consider maybe your core presentation, then which focuses on those seven elements that I talked about. You have your core presentation. Well, now if you better understand, for example, the sales and marketing team in your organization and what they really care about, now maybe you're tailoring the target condition to include how it would benefit sales and marketing in a way that resonates with them. And maybe you're talking about in your methodology section, you might be talking about how you might want to partner with sales and marketing at a certain step in your methodology to better connect with them, maybe likely get better results further down the road if you're partnering, collaborating with them early on. So it really all comes down to building this rapport and understanding about these different functions, and then just starting to incorporate what you've learned from those discovery conversations into your presentation. And I think it's very, you should have the expectation that you, as I said, you have like this core presentation, and you may have different versions of the same presentation for different audiences. You might have a version for even more technical people, maybe, or people on the shop floor actually running the experiments. And then you may have a version of the presentation for the chairman of the board, and then one for sales and one for marketing. And so, and that's okay. These are sort of minor tweaks to the core, but it's much more effective communication strategy to do that than to just try to get people to understand your point of view in the one way through the engineering lens that you live day to day. So
yes.
Yeah.
So it sounds like minor tweaks can really have an impact. And
Absolutely.
what's at stake if you just keep one version, for example, and you're not actually recognizing that your audience has changed?
Right. Well, then you won't get buy-in. I mean, you will absolutely lose out on opportunities to get buy-in for whether you're looking for an increased budget, or you're looking to hire people, or you're looking for, investment in your idea. If you're an entrepreneur, I mean, really, you're just going to lose out on additional resources and additional support when your message hasn't resonated with your audience members.
So you might be making your life easier in the short term by just keeping one version of the presentation, but
right.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about storytelling. What role does storytelling and other engagement techniques play in making presentations more compelling?
Absolutely. So I I think of storytelling in sort of two modes. One is telling stories about things, and that's actually the simple analogies that we were just talking about. So having a little bit, it's a mini story, like it's kind of like a Jiffy Loop. That's a mini story that you're telling people to help them paint a picture in their mind. And so telling stories about things using simple analogies and simplifying complex things is one type of story that technical folks need to get out. The other types of stories are stories about people. So these are the stories either about the team or about yourself or maybe about a customer or something that was somehow, related to whatever it is that you want to talk about. And I like for that, the hero's journey is a very well-known storytelling strategy that I think a lot of
Mm.
folks know. And I tend to simplify it a little bit myself. But if you can get comfortable with developing a bank of stories about your background, about times when maybe a mentor has really helped you, times when you've had to overcome challenges, times when you have had successes. Similarly, with your own team members, if you're a leader, if you can talk about some stories related to your team member, and of course, if you are customer facing at all, success stories, testimonials about customers. If you can just develop small little snippets of those types of stories, then you can weave them in your presentations all the time. And of course, I've told a bunch of stories just here on this podcast, and it's the idea is to bring things to life. I mean, when you think about persuasive communication, there is the emotional side of things that is a big part of persuasive communication, and that is through story. And so it doesn't have to be a super emotional story. It can be a very simple story, but it helps activate a different part of people's brains, and it engages them in a different way. And so becoming comfortable with telling stories can be really important. And I like to just think about a couple of different categories of stories and just write them out, just sort of do it offline as an exercise rather than try to necessarily come up with something on the fly. That can be a challenge, right? Especially if you're already nervous. If you're ever giving a
Right.
presentation, you're already super nervous. Like, don't try to be funny and don't try to tell a story that you haven't thought of in advance. Like, it's just not going to go well. But having just a couple of stories in those categories I talked about offline, you will be surprised at how many opportunities you actually have to weave them in.
Mm. Yeah, I love the idea of a story bank. Just as you go through your day, as you go through your week, in relation to the topic at hand, just keeping track of those things and refining them so you're ready. That's great.
And I would, if I may, I would also add, leaders, it's a great opportunity to tell stories to your team. They will connect with you in a much different way than if you are always focused on, the data and the goals and objectives and things like that. And I learned that pretty late on in my own career.
Mm.
I personally am very reserved. I rarely talk about myself. Very shy and introverted. I know it may not appear this way on this video, but this is a different thing. I turned myself on. Remember my ritual? I turned
Right.
myself on for this
Right.
presentation. I'm going to turn myself back off after this. And it wasn't until late in my career, and I just actually in a moment of unguardedness, a rare moment of unguardedness, I shared a personal story about a challenge that I had in my career, fairly recently, and I got such a positive response. I was shocked by how much people said, "Oh, I that really resonated with me. Thank you so much for sharing that." And then it activated them to feel open to kind of tell me things. I actually learned
Mm.
a lot about some of the challenges that some of the people in my staff were having that I could actually help with as a leader with the resources that I had. And so it made the team cohesion tighter. It made people relate to me in a stronger way. And it also made me a more effective leader because now I knew things about some of the people on my team that I didn't know before because I had been closed off. And I know that sometimes that can people can be hesitant to do that, particularly other reserved introverts like me. And we tend, I don't know, we tend to skew that way. Not everybody, and what I say about that is like, you have total control over the stories you choose to tell people. And so you don't have to disclose your deepest, darkest secrets. Like nobody's asking you to do that. But we are just saying, if you can just give a couple of, examples of things, challenges that you've overcome in a way that you're comfortable telling about, it's going to unlock a new level of sort of leadership and engagement with your team that I think you're really going to like.
Hmm. That's fascinating, and I can relate. I'm more of an introvert myself too, and sometimes trying to get people motivated by the metrics and the graphs alone, it's not enough.
Mm-mm.
So it's a great reminder. Okay, so you mentioned that great communication and presentations can increase the speed of investment into ideas, people, projects. Can you explain why this happens and share maybe an example of where effective presentation skills can really affect a major decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So when a decision maker is constantly thinking about how am I going to allocate resources? I mean, this is just people with resources. They're constantly thinking about how are they going to allocate resources. And so their day-to-day life is really just about pattern recognition, and they know, okay, these are the problems that I'm having in my organization, or these are the problems that I'm tasked with trying to solve. And so they're just going around looking, scanning their environment, listening to presentations or other means, scanning their environment to say, okay, could this be the thing that's going to solve my problem? Or is this the investment, forward-looking investment opportunity that I should make? And so when you can effectively communicate what you're doing and fit with what they're looking for, again, those elements that we talked about, it becomes a match. It becomes a match for them to say, oh yeah, that's the thing I want to invest in, or oh yeah, that's the thing I want to learn more about, right? So I mean, oftentimes people don't write checks, immediately upon a presentation, but oftentimes those things will get you in the door for the next round of evaluation and things like that. So that is sort of just how the decision making process works. And as I mentioned, earlier, I sit in a lot of pitch competitions. I mean, some of these pitch competitions, have $250,000 investments and so when we evaluate these pitches, we're looking for the exact things I mentioned. Of course, we have criteria. We have our own criteria for all of those things. But when we can easily match with what you're saying, because you've communicated those things to us, and we can say, yep, checks that box, not quite this one, but still better than the others, then that's where we allocate the resources. And that's really true for all decision makers who have resources to allocate. They're constantly trying to make this pattern recognition. And so when you communicate in a way that matches sort of their decision making process, it makes it much easier for them to do their work, and that speeds things up.
That's great. So, if there was one final piece of advice that you could give AEC leaders to focus on to improve their communication, what first step could you recommend that they take today?
The first step that you could take is to take whatever presentation you have in front of you, because we all have slide decks, so nobody is missing a slide deck. Take your slide deck and do some of this, go through the checklist. Do I have any acronyms? Do I have any really highly expert language? And just sort of do that. That is a great first step. And then the second thing I would do is that new presentation you have, practice delivering it with a different audience and see what kind of feedback you get.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Please remember, you can find all of the show notes from today's episode at aecleadershippodcast.com. There you'll find a summary of the key points that we talked about in today's episode, as well as all other links to resources, books, or websites that we mentioned.